Hello, everyone. Welcome. I think we'll get started now. There will be some more people entering the room as time goes by, but let's get started. Thank you for joining us for this public talk, Indian Ghosts, which is delivered by Tabish Khair of the University of Arhaus. We're delighted to have Tabish with us today. I'm Dr. Matt Foley. I am co-lead for the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies, and I'll be chairing the discussion today. So Tabish will talk for around about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. It would be appreciated if you could put your questions into the chat. We have my colleagues here, Emma Liggins and Ellie Beale, who are both moderating the chat today and should be able to see your questions there. We should have time at the end for 20 minutes or so to go over the questions and to get your thoughts on Tabish's talk. I'm not sure Tabish needs an introduction, but I have one prepared, and I just want to say a few words about Tabish before handing over to him for his talk. He's a major figure in fiction, poetry, and critical writing, and we're delighted to welcome him today as part of a fruitful day of discussion that we've been having across a number of scholarly panels on the overarching topic of global ghosts and regional hauntologies. Today's symposium, which runs into tomorrow, is a collaboration between St Teresa's College, Kerala, India, and the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies at Manchester Metropolitan University, UK. Our two public talks, today is Tabish's talk, and tomorrow we have a talk by Melissa Edmondson, have been kindly sponsored by Manchester Met's Go Global initiative. So special thanks to my colleagues Caroline Collier and James Draper, our international leads in the Manchester Met School of English, for supporting us with this programme today. Okay, now we turn to business. So Tabish is an Indian poet, a novelist and academic. He is an associate professor in the Department of English at Aarhus University in Denmark. His most recent book is the study Literature Against Fundamentalism, and he has a new novel, Drown All the Refugees, forthcoming very shortly. His influential work in Gothic and studies and haunting studies includes the excellent and much read monograph, The Gothic, Postcolonialism and Otherness, Ghosts from Elsewhere, from 2019, as well as his co-editing of the collection Transnational and Postcolonial Vampires from 2012. In his paper today, Tabish will make reference to a selective corpus of literary texts to discuss the narration of ghosts in Indian fiction. In so doing, he'll refer to his own creative practice in the context. I should add that refreshingly, Tabish is presenting today without any slides, so he'll speak to us directly, and also that this paper is being recorded to be watched on YouTube afterwards. So Tabish, welcome to Global Ghosts. We'd be delighted if you would begin your talk.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you to you, Elena, your colleagues, to the Manchester Centre of Gothic Studies and to the sponsoring universities for this invitation. I remember when you emailed me, I expressed some doubt about my ability to connect with cutting-edge research in the field. And I think I pointed out that largely last 10, 12 years, I've been engaging with both the Gothic, and I sort of feel I engage quite strongly with the Gothic. I feel very strongly about the Gothic. I'm one of the few post-colonial critics and writers who actually champions the Gothic over the magical realist, for that matter. But I've been doing that largely as a writer, simply because now I've crossed into the 60s and I can feel time, winged chariot hurrying near, and I want to get, let's say, broader text written before I cannot write anymore. However, Matt, you very kindly said that you would still want me to talk about what I have covered in the past largely, and that's what I'll be doing. I hope it will start a discussion. And I hope that many of you will be able to relate to it, connect to it, critique it, maybe during the question answer session right now, but also afterwards if you feel like emailing me. Having said that, I'll make my presentation, which is basically based on a written text. But even before that, I would say that this is an element of serendipity in this talk, because just yesterday I got the first copy of a novel that I am publishing right now in India, but published by HarperCollins, and it came pretty late to me. It's already been released in India, but that's one of the disadvantages of living in Denmark when you're publishing in England or India, America. And I'm just holding up the title here, Drown All the Refugees, and it's been illustrated by an extremely good Indian artist. And as you can see from this illustration, it does have something to do with ghosts. So having said that, I'll move on to my presentation. Matt, when I start running out of time, maybe when I have 5 minutes left or so, would you mind interrupting and letting me know?
Yes, of course, Tabish, no problem. I'll let you know.
Okay. As to start with, as I point out in my paper, Indian Ghosts, of the three major Hindu gods, Shiva, the god of death and destruction, is the one who has his tales most often linked with those of ghosts. Here's one such tale. Being finally forced out of his coma-like meditation and informed by his brother gods that his marriage has been arranged with Parvati, the great god Shiva proceeds in a lavish procession to his own wedding. He is accompanied by ascetics, gods, Gandharvas, Yakshas, and many other beings. He is also accompanied by Vetalas and Bhutas. Now, in other papers, I've pointed out how Vetala, which is very often translated as vampire, which is very often mistranslated as vampire, or to be actually covered by some other term. And this mistranslation is largely due to colonial exegesis, the fact that Vikram Vetala, this legendary collection of tales, was translated by its first colonial translator as Vikram and the Vampire. But anyway, Bhutas is closer to ghost, or Bhoot, as we would say in Hindi or Urdu or Hindustani today. And it can be more accurately translated as ghost. As one version of the Shiva Parvati wedding myth given to us in Manasamangal, a collocation of oral and written tales about a snake goddess, dated over the centuries of the late medieval period and down to the 18th and early 19th century. Dating texts in India can be quite a chore. As Manasamangal puts it, the gods, Gandharvas, and Yakshas in the procession numbered hundreds of millions. The ghosts were in the lead, the gods brought up the rear, and a very pleased Shiva advanced alongside. End of quote. After the ceremonies, Manasamangal tells us the revelers, which include dancing apsaras, celestial maidens, so to say, as well as dancing ghosts, return to Mount Kailash, the abode of Shiva. There, Shiva's divine peers and other gods take their leave one by one, but the Bhutas, the ghosts, so to say, demons, and Vetalas stay on. Popular myths also hold that the stories compiled in the Katha Sagara, 11th century Sanskrit text attributed to an unknown Brahmin called Shomadeva, are taken from a lost tome, Brihat Katha, the Ocean of Stories, considered the source book of all stories, which is said to have been written in Paisachi, the lost language of ghosts, it is said, as distinct from Sanskrit and Prakrit. In the myth of the lost book and the language of ghosts, Shiva plays the role of the transmitter and translator. Shiva, being the lord of death and destruction, is inevitably associated with ghosts and similar beings. In that sense, ghosts have been part and parcel of Indian narrative from the ancient and medieval periods to the present. However, supernatural beings have existed, as they do in most other folk traditions, as part of a complex world containing gods, humans, animals, birds, snakes, celestial beings, and also such presences as ghosts. It has been noted by anthropologists that the traditional African response to supposedly becoming a victim of what we call voodoo or obia is not that of terror or fear, but that of anger. The villager feels angry that someone has dared to take recourse to such forces against him and goes off to find a stronger, what we call witch doctor, as a counter. This differs from modernity influenced attitudes to such matters, and the reason is obvious. In a world where the natural and the supernatural exist as an almost indistinguishable bolus, the intrusion of the latter into the former cannot be the source only of fear. There is anger, maybe along with fear too, at the powers unleashed, and along with it there is a system that allows one to understand and counter such powers. This occult system is part of one's mundane material life, and in that sense the supernatural is part of the natural. Ordinary belief in almost all traditional societies is characterized by rituals and practices that assume the normal coexistence of the natural and the supernatural. By the way, this also applies to European societies. I don't have time to go into it, but if you look at even at, as late as early 20th century texts, like texts by Laurie Lee in England, you come across mention of ghosts and supernatural happenings without any clear demarcation between the natural and supernatural. And these, of course, are not metropolitan texts in most cases. But anyway, we leave that out. This kind of normal coexistence of the natural and supernatural ends with the rise of modernity, when the natural, being banished from the circle of material existence, can only recur if it is considered as recurring as fear, terror, horror. But as I would point out in this paper, also perhaps hope. I'll start off by talking a bit about colonial Indian ghosts, because my focus is largely going to be on Anglophone texts. There one can start off with Ruskin Bond's anthology, The Penguin Book of Indian Ghost Stories, which most of you will be familiar with. And the first tale there is a tale called Underdone, Overdone, Undone, by Francis William Bain. His collection called A Digit of the Moon, published in 1901, purportedly a collection translated by the author from a Sanskrit manuscript given to him by an unnamed Brahmin. A Digit of the Moon, elaborately footnoted, was the first of a series of such books published by Bain, who had been born in England, educated at Oxford, and worked for many years in colonial India. It is now clear that these Indian stories of Bain were not directly, or at times even massively, derived from any Sanskrit texts or traditions, and the author is seen today as a writer of Orientalist fantasies, which won him a good readership in Europe. Despite its lack of any traceable Indian source, the story Underdone, Overdone, Undone is a clever Orientalist fantasy, drawing upon elements that seem Indian, not least the indistinguishable bolus of the dead and the living. It is difficult to deny that Bain must have drawn upon extant Indian folk tales to construct at least some elements of the story. Even the story itself is a figment of his imagination. In Underdone, Overdone, Undone, a renegade Brahman who neglected the study of the Vedas and walked in the black path, unquote, strikes a deal with a Vetala, usually erroneously translated as vampire. Given a magic pair of dice that always enables him to win at games, and a spell to raise the dead, the Brahman kills and feeds his own brother to the Vetala, or the Vetal. However, trying out his spell to raise the dead on an untouchable's corpse, he gets frightened when, while still chanting the spell, he sees half of the corpse come crawlingly alive and half still lie stone dead. He runs away and is trailed by the half-alive corpse muttering, underdone, overdone, undone, through a life of ill-gotten riches, until finally he jumps down from a balcony in order to avoid this zombie once again and dies. There are a number of interesting elements from Indian traditions here, put to effective Orientalist and Gothic uses by Bain, the Brahman and his spell, the Vetala and the Untouchable, the pair of dice. Even to begin with, we can include the coexistence of the realm of the living with that of the dead, though this coexistence does not survive into the Orientalist narrative, which soon moves into Gothic tropes of terror, repulsion, horror, and dread. In many traditional Indian stories about supernatural beings, this might not necessarily happen, especially in the case of stories about ghosts. And if one wants to be a stickler for accuracy, one can argue that Bain's story is about a zombie rather than a ghost. However, I'm not going to kind of differentiate too much between these minor aspects in this paper. Somewhere else I might. Ghost stories were a major staple of colonial literature in India, given their popularity in 19th century Britain, and Kipling wrote quite a few tales of haunting and similar matters, 33 in all collected by Peter Heining. As I've noted in the Gothic, Postcolonialism and Otherness, in terms of their relationship to rational explanation, these tales vary from predominantly supernatural narratives, such as the phantom rickshaw and haunted subalterns, to basically offering a rational explanation, as in The Return of Imre or An Indian Ghost in England. It is noteworthy that while the latter kind can take place in both India and England, the former, the narratives that incline towards a supernatural and non-rational explanation, are confined to India or the Empire. Kipling does not easily allow real Indian ghosts to penetrate English spaces, though an Indian jackal might reach England and be mistaken for the devil's dog, as in An Indian Ghost in England. Kipling allows the English to be shaken out of their complacency in Indian spaces. Most often you refer to a story like The Strange Ride of Marrowby Jukes to illustrate that. So Kipling allows the English to be shaken out of their complacency in Indian spaces, but faithful to the colonial structure of power, he refuses to let real Indian ghosts frighten the British. Quote, no native ghost has yet been authentically reported to have frightened an Englishman, but many English ghosts have scared the life out of both white and black. End of quote. This is from his story titled My Own True Ghost Story. This is not just true of Kipling. The colonial landscape is often as Simon Hay puts it, is often populated with white ghosts rather than indigenous ones, and the story thus provides a sense of legitimacy through history to imperial occupation. End of quote. In the ghost stories by Kipling that take place in India, the essential colonial equation of power may be shaken, but it is never overturned. This is best illustrated in The Phantom Rickshaw, where, with conscious irony, the ghost of an English Memsahib, Mrs. Wessington, returns to haunt her lover, who had jilted her, on a rickshaw pulled by native bearers. These rickshaw pullers are the same as the bearers in real life, consumed by cholera a few days after her death. The narrator muses, quote, so there were ghosts of rickshaws after all, and ghostly employments in the other world. How much did Mrs. Wessington give her men? End of quote. While Kipling can safely be crowned the colonial king of Gothic and supernatural tales from India, very few of his tales actually feature ghosts. The two stories by Kipling included in Bond's The Penguin Book of Indian Ghost Stories are basically stories of, again, if one wants to be a stickler for accuracy, are stories of curse and werewolf. I refer to, in particular, to the mark of the beast, and or there's stories of what can be called zombies, the strange ride of Marrowby Jukes. In this talk, I have decided to concentrate on the subgenre of ghost stories, specifically defined, where ghosts are not just any supernatural being, but very specifically the spirit soul emanation of a dead person. One can actually argue that the zombie is opposed to the ghost, the former being a living body with a dead soul, and the latter being a living soul from a dead body. But again, I'm not going to enter into these. fine demarcations. There are two excellent colonial ghost stories in Bond's anthology, and both of them feature quintessential colonial settings of haunting: the Club Hotel and the railway track. Hilton Brown's The Fourth Man, 1930, features the ghost of an eccentric and wild colonial who, when alive, held that only tables of 4 companions made sense. After his death, he keeps joining tables of 3 men at his favorite hotel until finally asked to leave, after which the hotel fails miserably. In C.R. Corson's The Tail Light, 1927 or 1933, the dead engineer of a defective bridge appears with a lantern in a storm to save a train from plunging to death and destruction, something he had been unable to prevent many years ago when his bridge had been swept away, and he had died trying to save people. The colonial setting is also sometimes an element in Bangla ghost stories of the renowned Indian filmmaker Satyajit Ray, as well as the stories he wrote in English. An interesting one because it uses and overturns so many colonial and class binarisms is Ray's Indigo, where Bose, a post-independence Bengali man working in advertising in Calcutta, finds himself in a rundown dark bungalow. I guess all of you know, but in case you don't, it's a kind of government-run rest house. So both a post-independence Bengali man working in advertising in Calcutta, in Kolkata now, finds themselves in a rundown dark bungalow, a common colonial setting for ghosts, as Kipling also knew, out in the Bondukes. Slightly jittery, Bose questions the watchman about ghosts, and the watchman laughs away his fears. No ghost has ever been sighted. The only ghostly things are the skeletal remains of the indigo factory around it, because the dark bungalow was once the house of an English indigo planter. This intrigues Bose, as he is something of a self-declared expert on indigo plantation in India, with its sad history of global capitalism and colonial rapacity, and it also reassures him. But he wakes up at night to find his environment metamorphosed. The plantation has come alive. The restored factory looms in front of him. There are worker quarters further on. More uncannily, Bose feels different. He speaks differently, and he discovers that he has metamorphosed too. He is now the English planter. As the ghost of the English planter, he pens a diary entry expressing his loneliness. His friends have returned to England, his wife and son are dead, and he knows that he cannot go back to England because of his shady past here. He also knows that he has been a brutal master. Not one of his workers will regret his dying, and he is painfully aware that he is dying of malaria and other illnesses. His only real worry is Rex. We initially do not really know who Rex is. His only real worry is Rex, so much has he oppressed the natives, and so deeply is he hated, that he fears Rex will be stoned to death after his death. The planter's ghost, as Bose, takes a pistol, goes out into the veranda, and shoots Rex, his watchdog, and then puts the hot muzzle of the gun against his own temple. That is when Bose loses consciousness. When he wakes up the next morning, everything is as it was, in its safe, dilapidated, post-independence state. He is Bose again. The indigo factory is just a ruined chimney, as it was. Among other things, Ray gives a particularly rich and ironic twist to Hay's point that the colonial ghost story, as Simon Hay puts it, provided a sense of legitimacy through history to imperial occupation. And he does so by actually making a certain kind of big city, upper middle class, Anglophone, post-colonial subject inherit a colonial ghost, otherwise invisible to other kinds of post-colonial subjects, such as, for instance, the watchman of the dark bungalow. I mean, there's a lot that can be unearthed out of this connection. Bond notes in his introduction to the Penguin Book of Indian Ghost Stories that he has, quote, a complete run of the Indian State Railways magazine from 1927 to 1933. There is hardly an issue which does not carry a story of the supernatural. End of quote. The vast Indian Railways has obviously provided much material for ghost stories. And for instance, the only real ghostly section in Amitabh Ghosh's The Calcutta Chromosome makes good use of this tradition by featuring, so to speak, not just ghosts, but the ghost of an entire locomotive. The ghosts of entire locomotives also turn up in other stories. However, I leave this reference to the Calcutta Chromosome out because you're probably familiar with the novel, one of the few Anglophone novels that plays very creatively and in a very exciting way with generic elements. Ghosts also appear in other kinds of Indian English literary fiction too, such as Gita Hariharan's The Ghost of Vasu Master. My own early novel filming a love story, for instance. Also in magical realist texts such as Raj Kamal Jha's Fireproof, where the nameless dead of the 2002 Gujarat riots provide a preface to the main narrative of the novel, which features a deformed baby Ithin born during the riots. I do have certain doubts about whether one should use a term like ghost when talking of magical realism by and large, or if one can, one might not need to annotate it as ghost one or ghost two kind of, because one of my big problems with magical realism has always been that for magical realism to make any kind of sense outside just various other fabula and mass traditions. And as some critics have highlighted, the fantastic and the natural need to grow out of each other. There cannot be a real contrast between them. They are part of the same world. And that's actually one of the reasons I prefer what is called the Gothic tradition, despite its colonial tradition. The fact that very often in the colonial Gothic, the Gothic villain ended up being someone like me or someone from my kind of inheritance. So, despite that problem, I do feel that the Gothic, because it focuses on the contrast, on the difference, it focuses on what I would call otherness. Uh, I feel enables me, both as a writer and as a critic, to engage more with certain problems instead of sweeping them away, instead of in some way evading them by assuming that all of this can exist. I'm talking of ghost stories or other similar supernatural narratives. I don't usually talk of magical realism because I feel it moves that entire argument into a different area. And I prefer using the Gothic because of the contrast it offers, the fact that you can never totally explain or explain away or understand the difference of the other. That, as Emmanuel Levinas puts it, the other, I'm paraphrasing him in my words. So the other offers vast potential for friendship or connection. But of course, the other also offers reason for what I would call a scream, a shriek. And I think these two aspects have to be kept. The notion that the other can be softened into something that is transparent to me as the self is slightly disturbing to me. Just as the notion that empathy is the only thing we need to make a better world is slightly disturbing to me, and was disturbing also to Hannah Arendt, for that matter, who was, many of you would are probably more on social media than I am. I'm only on Facebook, but even on Facebook, you very often have this quotation by Elon Musk cropping up saying, the biggest weakness of Western civilization is empathy. I don't know whether he said it, but he's the kind of person who probably said it. And usually along with that, you have a quotation by Hannah Arendt propping up, saying that the decline of empathy marks the decline of civilization into barbarism. And every time I read that Hannah Arendt quotation, I said, "Oh, this cannot be her. That quotation must be wrong." And then obviously I couldn't remember anything from Hannah Arendt along those lines. And then I read an article in the New York Times, I think, where someone looked into it and said, "But Arendt never said it." Also because it made sense, because Arendt was extremely suspicious of empathy. Not she didn't say it was not necessary. That's not, she was not making elements. Of course, empathy is a cardinal human capacity, and like other cardinal human capacities, if it is weakened, it makes us diminish as human beings. There are lots of other such capacities. But Arendt understood very well that the claim to empathy would reduce the difference of the other. The idea that you empathize means that you, to some extent, identify with the person. But that is, of course, not possible if some kind of difference is what makes the other different from us, from the self, and the self different from the other, and the self different from other selves, in other words. And the other thing that I think Arendt also realized was that if one thinks of empathy as a political tool rather than a personal attribute, one moves towards some kind of totalitarianism, because the demand to empathize can be inflicted on us, and we can be told to empathize in certain ways, and in the process we can also fail to empathize in certain other ways. So by and large, this connects to my basic unease that I've had for 20 years with the magical realist narrative, and the fact that in my creative writing too, I have moved away from it completely. In my first novel, I tried to spoof it, but luckily it never came out internationally. And after that, I moved away completely, because while writing that novel, I came to feel that at least for me, magical realism offers two easy solutions, and I don't want these solutions. I don't think these solutions work. On the other hand, the Gothic offers something. Once you take into account its colonial heritage, you take it, and you can work against it or sometimes with it. It offers you a lot of a space to register the difference of the other, and also to register your difference as another self. So in that sense, that's how I look at this entire matter. Okay, now to get back to Ghosts again. One element I want to focus on this, and this again I talk about in my paper, Indian Ghost, is ghostly desire. Because, well, I'll explain why I want to talk about it. Discussing modern British ghost stories, Simon Hay notes that, quote, "In them the ghost is something that comes back, the residue of some traumatic event that has not been dealt with, and that therefore returns, the way trauma always does." End of quote. This is a valid remark that in general can be applied to many recent Indian ghost stories too. Partly also because the modern Indian ghost story in English and through English was marked by the tropes of 19th century colonial and hence British ghost stories. However, we should note what I consider an interesting feature, perhaps even a distinctive feature of the modern Indian ghost story, a feature that also seeps into stories written in English by Indians. To understand this distinctive feature, we might consider another aspect that Hay rightly associates with the British ghost story. Quote, "Haunted characters usually experience ghosts as horrifying, and their terror enacts the sudden visibility of the structures normally invisible beneath the surface." End of quote. True, ghosts might be terrible and horrifying in Indian stories, but they are as likely to be just thwarted, even desirous and desirable. This might not be surprising given a civilization that, as historian Romila Thapar puts it, was kept relatively sane by a lack of Saturn, and where souls are usually seen as transmigrating from body to body, and hell, except among minorities such as Christians and Muslims. I come from a Muslim background, by the way, so I guess I can bandy it around more freely, such as Christians and Muslims, is closer to a temporary purgatory than the eternity of Semitic damnation. One of the remarkable aspects of Indian ghost stories arises from this, and I'll use a story by Ruskin Bond. And I do consider him an Indian writer. He's been in India for very long, and he sees himself as an Indian writer. So why not? Uh, in Bond's story Topaz, the first-person narrator, also an author, sees a body dangling from a tall tree as he sits in his room. Rushing down to the tree, he finds no body in its branches, but meets the beautiful young girl Hamida, who tells him that her elder sister had hanged herself from the branches of the tree many years ago, as the consequence of a love affair with a man from another community. The narrator starts seeing Hamida, who gives him a topaz ring to wear, and once, while picking ferns, they find themselves, quote, in each other's arms, and slowly, as in dream, they sink into the soft bed of ferns, end of quote. When Hamida does not reappear the next day, and for days afterwards, the narrator inquires about her and discovers that the girl who had hanged herself did not have a sister and was called Hamida. He lapses into a vision of a body hanging from the tree again, and the topaz on his hand glows softly in the darkness as the forest seems to repeat the whisper heard among the ferns. It isn't time that's passing by, my friend. It's you and I. This is a good example of a ghost story in which the ghost, and there is a real ghost this time, not a zombie, is nothing to be frightened of. It is actually a kind of love story between a living person and a ghost, a trope that occurs in many Indian ghost stories. In such stories, as in this one, the ghost is not horrifying but desirable. At worst, the ghost suggests sadness, regret, the passage of time, the bridges and chasm between human beings. In The Dark River, a long story by the major 20th century Urdu writer Krishan Chandra, something similar takes place. The narrator protagonist stays in an abandoned palace said to be haunted by the ghost of a beautiful young woman who disappeared a decade ago. At night, lying on his bed, a bit like Jonathan Harker in Dracula's castle, when the three female vampires appear by his bedside, but to far less horrific effect. Chandra's narrator protagonist sees a beautiful, desirable woman who begs him to release her from the place. Next day, he is startled to encounter a woman who looks like the ghost he had met last night, and he is told that this is the younger sister of the woman who had disappeared. The younger sister has not spoken a word since the disappearance of the older woman and the supposed suicide of their father. Fascinated by the ghost, the narrator stays on in the palace and is visited again by the spectre with whom he sleeps and to whom he makes love. Later on, it is revealed that the mute younger sister has been playing the ghost and has slept with the narrator in order to avenge her sister, who had been procured for sex by a colonial officer, with the complicity of the uncle and other powerful people in the village. She did so on learning that her sister's ghost had appeared to the narrative protagonist, also partly driven by a desire to save him from the consequences of his fascination with the ghost. Though the ghost appears only once in this story, right at the start, the first vision is the dead sister's ghost, not the living younger sister. Though the ghost appears only once in this story and is then, so to say, replaced by the living sister, once again the relationship between the ghost and the living is not just that of death and fear, but also of life and love. At one level, the desirable ghost might present a particularly South Asian angle on what Hay notes as a quintessential element of the British ghost story. The British ghost story, I'm quoting, the British ghost story is preoccupied with the status inconsistency, that nagging sense that wealth and lineage had become two competing standards of eminence or power, that rank and money had been cruelly dissociated from each other. End of quote. You can see this also in Anglophone texts, more recent Anglophone texts. Most interestingly, actually, in Annie Zaidi's, it's written Gulab. In Urdu, and the word would be Gulab, but I guess the English translation would be Gulab. And it's written Gulab with a G and not a GH as we would do. And I mean, those of you from India would be aware that we almost never pronounce ghost. We pronounce ghost, because it's written with GH. And in North Indian languages, the G and H are combined to make the G sound. So when I give a talk that features ghosts to an international audience, I have to regularly remind myself that it's not a ghost, it's a ghost. Okay.
Tabish, just to let you know, as you requested, that you have 5 minutes left
perfect.
now. So thank you. Keep going. It's fantastic.
Yeah, no, perfect. I probably have 4 or 5 minutes left anyway. Perfect. In the Indian story, I think this gap between lineage and wealth seems to have a larger canvas. Ghosts are often the consequence of a status, wealth, power, rank, money being used to cut universal bonds such as those of love. It is society in terms of status, rank, religion, caste, or class that interferes and creates the ghost, or is finally subverted by a ghostly love story, or sometimes both. The preponderance of ghostly love stories in Indian fiction might be due to the fact, no matter how tangentially realized by Indian authors like Christian Chandra, Zaidi, or Bond, that the primary purpose of ghosts in traditional narratives was never that of just invoking terror, fear, or suspense. These effective possibilities do exist, but they exist along with other emotional and intellectual responses. It is fascinating that these other dimensions are revealed even in modern Indian ghost stories, where desire is not necessarily opposed to death, but conjoined with it. The living and the dead fall in love. I'm not making the rather belabored and deceptive point that binarisms and dualisms are a European prerogative, and hence ghost stories from the Indian subcontinent avoid the usual dichotomies of good, evil, alive, dead, heaven, hell, earth, netherworld, and even despite a grain of truth in what Thapa has to say in a historical context, God, devil. Such dualisms are by no means purely European. Manichaeism has an Eastern origin, for instance, though one can claim with good evidence that slavery-based, race-conscious colonial cultures with writing-based literacy and a penchant for scientism, such as 19th century Europe, would have developed and consolidated such binarisms in ways both more hegemonic and more horrific. Having said that, it does seem to be a tendency in Indian ghost stories to depict ghosts not just as threats and objects of fear, but also as possibility, hope, and sources of love. A recent and contemporary tendency that in other literary forms can be traced to ancient and medieval texts, which similarly do not segregate the natural and the supernatural, or operate with the fixed binarism of life, death, or good, evil. It is not far-fetched to claim this tendency might have something to do with the tenor of thinking that sees souls as migrating from body to body, and while believing in monsters and devilish beings lacks a Satan. The most satanic villain in Indian myth, Ravan, is both learned and partly good, and no god in Indian traditions, I won't even name the gods, because who knows whom I might offend, no god in Indian traditions is faultless from every perspective. Hence, the easy binarism of death life gets nuanced to such a level that Indian ghost stories cannot be just about crime, revenge, power, fear, terror. They can be, but they cannot be just about those elements. They can also be about hope, desire, and love, and sometimes all of it at once. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tabish, for that really fascinating talk. You've generated quite a few questions in the chat. I hope you're able to navigate to the chat, and you'll be able
Yeah,
to
I'll go into the chat box and look at it.
fantastic.
Yeah. Oh yeah, quite a few questions. Okay.
Fantastic. So what I'll do is I'll start from the top, and we have 10 minutes or so to try to respond to as many questions as possible. What I think I've allowed those who've typed questions into the chat to use their mic if they would like to, but I'll read the questions out, and hopefully you can read them as well, Tabish, and allow you to answer them. So we had a very early question within a couple of minutes. Naveen asked about her research into jinns in South Asian literature and pop culture. And they'd be interested to know your thoughts on how the jinns is perceived in South Asia as it borrows from Hindu and other vernacular supernatural stories and folklore.
Yeah, sure. No, this is a fascinating question. If I start talking about it, it will take another lecture. But I mean, the first thing to bear in mind about jinns is that jinns are not really supernatural beings at one level for Muslims. It comes from Muslim tradition. Jinns are accepted in Islam. Okay, ghosts are not accepted in Islam. Actually, the religious Muslim position is that ghosts cannot exist, but the religious Muslim position is that God created human beings and created jinns. Human beings are created of earth. Human beings are created of fire. Okay, and so in that sense, if you think of jinns, the way we understand jinns is largely through translated text, where the jinn comes out of a bottle and grants you wishes and so on and so forth. So in that case, jinn becomes a very interesting creature. If you look at the jinn in traditional Muslim ways of narrating it, and then you look at how the jinn has come into being in South Asia. So I mean, and I think that so it ends up being two completely different things. You can think of the modern jinn as a supernatural being. If you think of the Muslim heritage of the jinn, then the jinn is just one of the beings invented, created by God. Okay, so
yeah, it's fascinating, and I think a lot of the kind of Indian spectres that we've been hearing about across the day today have been tied to religious spaces or ritualistic spaces, maybe in a much more overt way than some of those British ghosts that we encounter in the British tradition. So Christina's asked a question as well about the role of hope. So I'm really curious about the role of hope in these encounters with the supernatural. Could you please elaborate on the presence of hope in these occurrences? Christina currently leads a project devoted to the representation of hope in Anglophone 21st century literature. Quite a big topic to take on.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd say hi to Christina because I've met her on a number of occasions in other post-colonial contexts in the days when I used to go around. Christina, I guess there are two ways to answer this again. I personally, despite my great interest in the supernatural, do not believe in the supernatural. I do not really believe in ghosts. I do not actually even believe in the kind of divinity that religious people believe in. But I do believe in these very complex conjectures that enable us to be human in very complex ways. So in that sense, if you think of the supernatural, I think of divinity also along those lines, in the sense that the humanity of human beings come into being as a relationship to divinity. And how we define divinity makes us define who we are. So, I mean, very simply. But and similarly, if you think of the supernatural along those lines, then the supernatural offers us this option of going beyond the natural, beyond the normal, beyond the mundane, and that is hope. I mean, and it is in that case that I think sometimes the supernatural is used, and that's how I use the supernatural, especially in Drown All the Refugees, which use it occult. I use it to suggest the fact that something else can be done, and to illustrate this a bit in a more cogent manner, I would actually suggest to you also because of your project, would suggest to you to look at perhaps late 19th, early 20th century Russian texts. Not just by people like Gorky, who are known to belong to the revolutionary way of thinking, but also people who are largely seen as political, like Anton Chekhov. And one of the things that fascinates me, I'm actually working on a paper around this, but it requires so much rereading. It would take a couple of years before I finish. One of the things that fascinates me is that all these texts are very often extremely conscious of the injustice of the world, the fact that so many cannot achieve what they might have achieved otherwise. But at the same time, they're also very aware of some kind of better world, not necessarily a socialist world. It's much more than that. It's almost like the universe is full of possibility. Then they're very extremely aware of that. When I look at Anglophone literature, actually, I don't find that kind of awareness. I find a lot of criticism. It can be in George Orwell, it can be in Steinbeck, but by and large, that awareness is much more ironic, much more shamefaced. And I often wonder why this awareness is so unabashed in some Russian literature around the time of just before the Soviet Revolution. Whatever happened with the Soviet Revolution, that's another matter. Well, no one wants to defend Stalin and people like that. Whether that kind of thing did not actually lead to some kind of change, whether hope is not actually the reason why things happened, and whether the world we're living right now is such a sad one because we have been told in the 1990s there is no alternative. Obviously, I think the supernatural suggests alternatives.
Yeah, that idea of maybe the transcendent coming out of the supernatural and the hopeful is, that's something that's not as emphasized perhaps in the Anglophone tradition, as you say, which is much more associated with guilt and revenge and justice from the past, etc. So yeah, I think it touches as well on a question that we've had from, apologies if I'm not pronouncing this correctly, Snehashis, and their research explores belief systems, and they're interested in how belief systems can blur the distinction between external supernatural horror and internal psychological experience. How would you distinguish Indian ghost narratives from European Gothic hauntings and their relationship to memory? Are Indian ghosts more frequently embedded within communal and cultural memory, while European Gothic ghosts are more often read through personal memory, trauma, and repression?
That's a very complex question, and I'm not sure I will be able to answer it offhand because that would actually require looking at text much more closely, something I've not really looked at. I would not make a very clear divide, but that kind of distinction might exist. I would not make a very clear divide because obviously these traditions have influenced each other. Last 200 years, I mean, the literary worlds have influenced each other. But there could be a trend, a tendency, and the tendency you point out could be part of that. When it comes to the first part of your question, external supernatural horror and internal psychological experience, I do think that some of the most interesting texts I find interesting tend to combine the two. One good example in the Western tradition would be A Turn of the Screw, Henry James. I mean, the argument goes on: is real ghosts or not? and that's part of the fascination of the text. And I also, when I use ghosts in Night of Happiness, that's what I try to do as well, in the sense that it's somewhere in between, or it's one or the other, but it's not very clear. So in that case, I don't think one can totally distinguish between external supernatural horror and internal psychological experience in the contemporary context. In the past, maybe one could, because one believed in, say, the devil. And the devil, of course, would come into being. Even then, psychological elements would come into play, but from the 19th century onwards, I think it becomes very, very difficult. Even when some kind of devilish element is unleashed in the human being, as in, say, Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So that would be my answer to the first question. And And the second question is that I think it's a fascinating idea, but one needs to look at it with greater focus than I bring to bear at the moment.
Well, I think you've done an excellent job in the 30 seconds or so that you had there, Tabish, to respond to that. And it does lead us on to connecting across a number of the other questions that are in the chat. And we won't have time to go down each one, but I'll maybe save one about your creative practice for the last question. I just wanted to pick up on this idea that's come up in the chat and was really quite central to your talk, which was the distinction that you make between Gothic and magical realism, and you know, something like, I know you've written on Henry James's The Turn of the Screw in the past, and my sense is that you see Gothic as leaving that sense of hesitation there dangling at the end of the narrative, whereas magical realism provides something alternative to kind of deal with otherness as you understand it.
Yeah, I mean, would you repeat the last bit, Matt? Because I'm not sure I got the last bit. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. So I think that from what I understand about your distinction between the Gothic and magical realism, that the Gothic leaves a sense of hesitation at the end of the narrative, whereas magical realism uses the supernatural to kind of create a different framework around that hesitation.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so let's have a look at the final question then, and then we'll close things up for today. Now, Krista's question on the side touches upon your interest in you know, the publishing world and your creative writing, and she asks, what do you wish contemporary editors and publishing professionals knew about either Indian ghost stories or the Orientalist tradition? And what was your experience in writing your own socio-political ghost novel?
That's a very difficult question to answer, Krista. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm an embittered writer because I'm fairly happy. I mean, I set out from a small place. I didn't know whether anyone would publish me. And I'm quite happy that I get published, very often internationally, but at least in India, I have a kind of dedicated readership, so small but dedicated, and I do get published here and there, get translated occasionally. So I won't call myself embittered, but obviously in the process, writing for 30 years now, I've also come to realize how publishing works, and many of these ideas, these thoughts that we have exchanged, which actually are very interesting, would not even enter the consideration of any publisher. They operate more in terms of what I would probably call memes, in the sense of what would come across, and you might have a thoughtful notion there, and if that turns into a meme that is marketable, they will get it and they'll promote it, and you might actually end up writing a very successful book because of that. But it won't be because of your thoughtful argument or notion or perspective. It will be because of the meme aspect. So that's how I would put it. And so when I write, I don't really write with publishers in mind, and that's also one big advantage. I think one of the few books I wrote that actually was quite successful internationally was The Thing About Thugs, and that's also the only really post-colonial book that I wrote. so it fitted into the publishing idea of what I should be writing. And after that, I wrote a book that's called How to Fight Islamist Terror from the Missionary Position. And this big American publisher that had published The Thing About Thugs, my agent sent this manuscript to them, and they said, "Oh, why is he writing about these topics? He's getting to have a readership as a neo-Victorian writer. He should write about write another neo-Victorian crime mystery." So they didn't even want to read it. Okay, I think that is they wouldn't even want to read things that don't fit into the idea of what they can market, what they think should be done.
Yeah, the confines of the marketplace. It's an interesting place as well to leave the conversation. And I would just like to say thank you so much for your time, Tabish, and also apologies to those attending who we couldn't quite get to all the questions. Your talk generated so much response in the chat. We really appreciate your time, and we wish you all the best, and with the next stages as well of Drown All the Refugees, which is, as you say, is coming out shortly. So all the best for the publication and the publishing tour.
Thank you, Matt. And people who want to send me questions can always email me. I'm easy to find, Aarhus University English Department. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you, Tabish. And to all of our people who are here, who are also at the symposium, the academic symposium, we'll see everyone at 9 a.m. Tomorrow, British time, to get started again on the second day of the symposium. But thank you once again, Tabish, and we really appreciate your talk and your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.